Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dennis Stone from the Jacksonville Urban League Center for Advocacy and Social Justice. And thank you for joining our monthly conversation on racial healing and reconciliation. We're really excited tonight to have Rodney Hurst, civil rights activist, Black historian, and author. As he puts it in his biography, he reminds us that he's a father, a grandfather, and a great-grandfather, a widower, a cancer survivor, and a civil rights activist. He's also a military veteran and award-winning author of 3 books. His first book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, is a personal account of the 1960 sit-in demonstrations in Jacksonville and Axe Handle Saturday, which I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. In that, he recounts the segregated civic, political, and educational climate of Jacksonville in the 50s and 60s, the 1960 Jacksonville Youth Council NAACP sit-ins, and the violent event, the Axe Handle Saturday. Due to the blackout of local news about these important civil rights events in Jacksonville, his book is the only historical accurate description of these sit-ins and the violence of the Axe Handle Saturday. It won over a dozen awards, including the 2008 USA National Best Books Award, National Book Competition, first placed Gold Medal Award for Multicultural Nonfiction, and the Florida Book Awards Bronze Medal for Nonfiction. As I said, he has 3 other books, but we will save those for another time or later. But I will say this, that not only does he have a significant amount of experience lived as well as learned, but he's a wonderful speaker, and we're really happy to have you with us tonight, Rodney. Thank you for speaking and welcome.
My pleasure, Dennis. In the introduction, when I wrote the bio, I was in the process of writing my 4th book. My 4th book is called Black and Brilliant, and it was written for 12 to 18-year-olds. Well, see, today is Tuesday night. I got an email from a book competition, a national book competition, that my book won the gold medal for young people 12 to 16, those 16 plus, and the Southeastern Regional Book of the Year. So now I can add all 4 books are award-winning books. It has been important to me to write about experiences, cultural experiences, as a Black person in this country, because it is a continuing quest for white folk and Black folk to understand what Blacks accomplished in the 300 years of slavery in this country, and who they were and what they accomplished prior to slavery. I always tell young Blacks and young whites too that the history of Black folk did not start with slavery. In American history, in that vernacular, it is almost a given that white folk discovered Black folk when they kidnapped them and brought them to this country, and that is far from being the truth. When I was 6 or 7, preteen, I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. And my pastor says, favor ain't fair. But I am walking around, I'm 2 years in chronological age behind my classmates, but I'm seeing some of the same things that they are seeing. And during my time, during my childhood, then there were visible signs, those visible vestiges of segregation and racism to let you know who you were and where your place was. So we had colored and white signs for water fountains. We had colored lunch counters and white lunch counters. We had Negro waiting rooms and white waiting rooms for a bus station, for a train station. When you went to a governmental office, there was a Negro waiting room and a white waiting room. When you went to a doctor's office, there was a Negro waiting room for patients and a white waiting room for patients. And I would ask why. I was brought up in the Baptist church, became an Episcopalian, confirmed when I was 13. I am now a Baptist again. But all this time, I'm brought up in the church, and I am asking, aren't we sisters and brothers based on what the Bible teaches, brotherhood and sisterhood? That's the case. Why am I being separated? Why are things separate in such a way where there is this dual journey, this dual walk, just based on the color of my skin? And even though as a youngster that did not resonate with me, the older I got, the more I began to understand that the only difference was that I had a Black hue of skin. When I went to the 8th grade, I was 11 years old. My family transferred from one Black neighborhood to another Black neighborhood, and I transferred from one Negro junior high school to another Negro junior high school in Jacksonville. And I enrolled in an American history class that was taught by Mr. Rutledge Henry Pearson. And Mr. Pearson would explain that first day of the class, he would explain to his 8th grade students this 8th grade American history book approved for Negro students in this Negro junior high school. These are actual classifications in the Negro division of the Duval County public school system. But this American history textbook for 8th graders, for 8th grade Negro students, only had the names of 2 Blacks in those books: George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington. And Mr. Pearson told us to leave that American history book at home. He did not want us to study American history from the racist and bigoted viewpoints of white textbook authors and white historians who only saw fit to include the names of 2 Blacks, as if they were the only Blacks in the history of this country to make salient contributions. So he taught us American history outside of that approved American history book for Negro students. He had us write letters to Althea Gibson and Jackie Robinson and Thurgood Marshall and Roy Wilkins. He had us do book reports. I did my first book report in 8th grade in his class on a person named Toussaint Louverture, who is the father of Haiti. And then when we got the responses back to those letters that we sent out, and we did get responses back, we had to write up reports on those responses, just like we did reports for the books that we read, and we put them up in the classroom, and they had to be typed, double spaced, 2 to 3 pages. We were 8th graders. We did not know how to type. Obviously, there were no computers and printers. But when we finished those book reports, we were very proud because it was Negro History Week every day in Mr. Pearson's class. And the importance in that then, 1955, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who started Negro History Week after he started an organization called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which is now the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. But he started the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915, and in 1926, he started Negro History Week. Because as a graduate of Harvard, he was the second Black in this country to get a PhD from Harvard University. W.B. Du Bois was first. He felt the need, and he felt it very necessary, to make sure that Blacks, Negroes at the time, were versed and understood some of the contributions that people who look like them made to this country. And I think it is so ironic and hypocritical and also racist that today we have white elected officials all over this country who have decided that somehow telling the truth about American history is divisive. Yet throughout American history, which I call incomplete, dishonest, and racist, is divisive. Young people today, young people yesterday, our parents, our grandparents, in the public school system, in colleges and universities, are fed tasteless and bland baby food, and we are told that it's gourmet food as American history, and we eat it up. We never question what's in the textbook or what the teacher stands up and talks about, either in public schools or in colleges and universities. And we take that incomplete, dishonest, and racist history with us and throughout our lives, and we regurgitate it to folk that we come in contact with. It gets to be a norm as we understand American history, and it is as incorrect and divisive as it can be yet today to teach Black history or to talk about Black history or to have a Black history book. White elected officials are basically saying that that's divisive. So let me dwell just a bit in that, and Dennis, please keep me on point in terms of time. And by the way, those of you who have questions, ask the questions in whatever way that it's set up. Keep your iPods and your iPhones and your tablets and your laptops, because I'm going to say some things that you have not heard before. So if you want to look them up and decide to challenge me on what I say, that's fine. Just make sure that your information is correct when you challenge me. So let's just delve just a bit in what I call incomplete, dishonest, and racist American history. We celebrate a holiday, only one of two holidays named for individuals. Christopher Columbus Day, the other one is Martin Luther King Day. But Christopher Columbus Day, we celebrate his birthday as the discoverer of America, and Christopher Columbus never set foot in the continental United States. Christopher Columbus landed in Hispaniola, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. He was greeted by indigenous people called the Tanos Arawak Indians, or indigenous people. They had no weapons. And Christopher Columbus and his men immediately started to enslave or imprison or take these Arawak Tanos Indians, indigenous people, as captives, sending the young girls back to Spain and Italy as sex slaves. Christopher Columbus was the first slave trader in this hemisphere, and his son Diego was the first slave trader of African flesh. We all know, "Listen, my children, and you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," a poem written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow 100 years after it was supposed to have taken place. That ride never happened. Betsy Ross never sewed the first flag. Benjamin Franklin did not put a key on a kite, fly the kite up in the air to have the key on the kite struck by lightning, and therefore Benjamin Franklin invented electricity. That never happened. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Words written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, and at the time he wrote those words, Thomas Jefferson owned more enslaved persons than any other person in Albemarle County, Virginia. Francis Scott Key was an elitist. He felt like the only thing that Africans were capable of doing was being servants and tending to the needs of whites. And if any wanted to do more than that, they should be sent back to Africa. During the War of 1812, the British said to escaped slaves and those who were enslaved that if you come and fight with me against America, we will give you your freedom and also find a place for you to stay. And the British called them colonial marines. During the War of 1812, Francis Scott Key became a lieutenant. And in a battle, he led his men, American soldiers, against the colonial marines, Black, former slaves, those that had escaped, in a battle. And the colonial marines won that battle and won it quite decisively. A few months later, Francis Scott Key went to the British to beg them to surrender his friend, Dr. Beans, who had been captured by the British. He was not a captive on a British ship, as some American history books taught or include. While he was begging for the release of one of his friends, of Dr. Beans, the British fired on Fort McHenry in the harbor of Baltimore, Maryland. And during that battle, many of the colonial marines were killed. They were part of the battle. And Francis Scott Key started writing the Ode to Fort McHenry, a poem. And in that poem, he wrote about how good he felt when he saw these slaves being killed and their blood leaving their body and making up for how much they had contaminated the earth of this country. Star Spangled Banner has everything to do with war. It has nothing to do with patriotism. There are 4 stanzas to the Star Spangled Banner, and this particular stanza about the racism of the author of the national anthem of this country. Is stanza number 3. We were not taught in school, and many young people are not taught today, that the writer of the Three Musketeers, the Count of Monte Cristo, and the Man in the Iron Mask, Alexander Dumas, was Black. We are not taught, we're not taught that the father of Russian literature, Alexander Pushkin, was Black. That Hannibal the Great, who took these hordes of elephants through the Swiss Alps and who conquered every nation on the known earth at that time, was Black. We are not taught that St. Augustine of Hippo, for whom the city St. Augustine is named, and who was one of the seminal figures in the philosophy and in understanding Christianity, was Black. We are not taught that Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg is the great, great, great grandmother of Queen Elizabeth II, the recently deceased Queen of England, and she was Black. And we are not taught that Ludwig van Beethoven's father and grandfather were Moors, M-O-O-R-S, Spanish Africans. When a young Black person goes into a classroom and opens a history book, or opens a literature book, or opens a science book, and he or she cannot read about the salient contributions by folk who look like them, yet you can read about Europeans and white Americans and what they contributed to this country, then the playing field is not even. So they're not taught that the first person to perform open heart surgery or heart surgery was Daniel Hale Williams, who was Black. We don't include in the history books that the man who classified blood plasma, Charles Drew, was Black. That Benjamin Banneker invented the first clock and completed laying out the city of Washington, D.C., that he was Black. That Matt Henson was the first person to set foot on the North Pole and he was Black. That Garrett Morgan invented the gas mask and also the variation of the traffic light that we have today with the 3 lights. When he started working on the traffic light, it just said stop and go. He put the caution light in and synchronized all 3. He was Black. We are not taught that Granville Wood invented an engineering device to go on a train to let the train engineer know when another train was near. We are not taught that Elijah McCoy, 45 inventions, including 15 inventions for long distance trucking and lubrication. And when they talk about the real McCoy at that time, they were talking about inventions by Elijah McCoy. So it is deliberate. It is deliberate that you don't talk about the contributions made by those persons who look like me. I met a, is there a question, Dennis? Dennis?
Sorry, no question.
I met a couple of years ago here in Jacksonville, we had the inaugural Civil Rights Conference. And one of the persons who spoke at that conference was Dr. Freeman Hrabowski, H-R-A-B-O-W-S-K-I III. He's originally, and with that, a name like Hrabowski, he was Black. He came from Birmingham. He was part of the Birmingham Children's Crusade. He was arrested when he was 13. doused with the fireman water hoses in Birmingham, arrested, stayed in jail for 3 days at age 13. But he became the president of University of Maryland at Baltimore College, UMBC, at age 40 and stayed there for 30 years, retired last year. And they specialize in the STEM curriculum: science, technology, engineering, math. And he said one night, a few years ago, he got a call from one of his students, one of his graduates, and the graduate said, "Dr. Hrabowski, we did it. We discovered the vaccine for the COVID virus." Her name was Kizzmekia Corbett. She was Black, but she was the lead doctor scientist on the team that discovered the vaccine for COVID. Henrietta Lacks died 60, 70 years ago. But she had contracted cancer. And when the scientists and doctors isolated some of her cancer cells, they found out that her cancer cells did not die the way other cancer cells from other persons would die. So they could perform more experiments on her cells than they could on others. And they were able to use her cell from Henrietta Lacks, now called, these cells were called HeLa, H-E-L-A. And many pharmaceutical companies made billions of dollars off the cells that came from the body of Henrietta Lacks, L-A-C-K-S. And they didn't tell her family, did not tell her. She died. She never knew. Did not tell her family that their mother, their sister, their grandmother was this great person that they should be benefiting from her cancer cells that's now being used by scientists all over this country and eventually into the world. And many pharmaceutical companies got obscenely wealthy as a result. And finally, in 2023, last year, as a result of a suit filed on behalf of the family with the lead attorney being Ben Crump, they filed suit against a dozen or a number, let me put it like that, pharmaceutical companies. They were compensated. The amount of the settlement was not disclosed, but it was the first time that had happened. A. Philip Randolph, who was born in Crescent City, Florida, moved to Jacksonville when he was 2. Graduated from Cookman Institute, which was the only institution in the state of Florida where Blacks could graduate from high school. He graduated in 1907, valedictorian of his class here in Jacksonville at the Cookman Institute. And later, Mary McLeod Bethune merged her Mary McLeod Bethune School for Girls with the Cookman Institute in Jacksonville, and that's where the name Bethune-Cookman comes from. But A. Philip Randolph, after representing Black laborers and janitors and those porters who cleaned up after rich white folk on these sleeping cars by the Pullman Company, after developing an organization called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He fought for these Black men to get a labor contract for 12 years, from 1925 to 1937. It is considered one of the greatest labor contracts in the history of the labor movement. And in the early 1940s, A. Philip Randolph challenged President Roosevelt to do something about jobs for Blacks in federal employment, and threatened a march on Washington in 1941. And President Roosevelt decided to start or to create what was called the Fair Employment Practices Commission to hire Blacks. And that commission led to Katherine Johnson of Hidden Figures being hired. And of course, as the computers were beginning to start, those of you who were familiar with the story know that astronaut Alan Shepard and John Glenn would not go up in a rocket until Katherine Johnson checked the figures of the computer. It would have been nice if young Black girls could have read about that in a book instead of seeing that on the movie screen. It would have been good if this country were honest enough to talk about these contributions as opposed to waiting until Hollywood made a film about it so they can make some money as a result. I met Thurgood Marshall when I was 14. When Mr. Pearson would stand up in front, when he first stood up in front of our class and he told us to leave the book at home, he also told us that freedom is not free. If you're not a part of the solution, then you are part of the problem. And he encouraged us all to join the Youth Council NAACP, which I did at age 11. I became president at 15 and led the sit-in demonstrations, and that led to Axe Handle Saturday at age 16, 2 months after I graduated from high school. But I'm sitting in a restaurant in Jacksonville next to the NAACP office at the corner of Beaver and Broad Street. And in walks Earl Johnson, who was the NAACP attorney, Thurgood Marshall, and Constance Baker Motley. And I talk about this in 2 of my 4 books, the books that you see right above my head here. Now, when you meet, I'm 14, when you meet someone like a Thurgood Marshall, they are bigger than life. We had studied about Thurgood Marshall. I knew who Thurgood Marshall was, did not know who Constance Baker Motley was. Later found out in that conversation that Constance Baker Motley was the lawyer, the only female in the what I call the dream team, the Brown decision of 1954 that integrated the schools. She wrote the legal brief that went to the Supreme Court that led to that decision by the Supreme Court. Ketanji Brown Jackson, when she became the first Black female appointed to the Supreme Court by President Biden, she listed Constance Baker Motley as her hero. Thurgood Marshall and Attorney Johnson and Ms. Motley came over to the table. I mean, I'm awestruck. My mother would tell me when I was awestruck, my mouth would open and she would always tell me to close my mouth. She would have told me that a number of times that day because I know my mouth stayed open. So we had a bunch of questions to ask this giant, big man too. And he started telling us a story about the Groveland Four. And I won't get into all of the particulars about it, but where's the book? But this is the book here that was written by Gilbert King. It's called The Devil in the Grove. It won a Pulitzer Prize. 4 Black men were accused of raping a white female they did not do. And Willis McCall, who is considered one of the most racist sheriffs in the history of this state and in the South, when they arrested these four men eventually, they killed one during the arrest phase, they tortured another, and he pled guilty, which he did not do, but they tortured him into a guilty plea. And when they had the trial, the remaining two Black persons were given the electric chair, a death penalty, death sentence. Thurgood Marshall, who filed the appeal on the case, was able to have the case, that verdict thrown out. So he was in Florida doing some investigatory work based on the new trial that they were going to have. And Willis McCall had found out that he was in Groveland, Florida, a part of Lake County. Back during those days, there were no hotels and motels, so Blacks stayed in what we call Black B&Bs. There were some Black folk had homes designated as guest homes for people to come and stay. So Thurgood Marshall was staying at, in effect, a Black B&B. And a Black funeral director went to his house, knew where he was staying, because when a celebrity like Thurgood Marshall came to town, everyone in the Black community knew it. But he went to the house where Thurgood Marshall was staying, and he told him that the sheriff had sent out some goon squads to find him. And he said, but I've got a plan to get you out of Groveland, Florida. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Now, this is Thurgood Marshall telling the story. So 15 minutes later, the funeral director comes back with a hearse. And in the back of the hearse was a casket. And he told Thurgood Marshall, I am going to put you in this casket. I'm going to drive you to the next county and to Ocala. And a man will take you from Ocala to Jacksonville so you can get on the train. He said, yeah, I want to go back to New York. Okay. Thurgood Marshall got in the casket. Man takes him to Ocala, somewhere in between him getting Thurgood Marshall out of Groveland. Obviously, he gets out of the casket. Turned him over to this man who then drove Thurgood Marshall on to Jacksonville. I'm telling this story in Orlando at a speaking engagement, and afterwards an elderly gentleman, a Mr. Fieldler, came up to me and said, Mr. Hurst, I had to smile as you were telling the story about Thurgood Marshall. I said, oh, really? You're familiar with that story? He said, yes, sir, I am. I am the man that they brought Mr. Marshall to drive to Jacksonville, Florida. I was telling Gilbert King, the gentleman who wrote the book, who won the Pulitzer Prize, and he told me, he said, Rodney, I had heard about that. But this is about that story, the first time I'd had it documented. Now, I tell that story because we look at some of these civil rights greats as if it was just turning the pages in a book, but their lives were in their hands every day. Vernon Dahmer, who was killed in Mississippi, president of the Mississippi Conference of Branches, because he was registering people to vote. The Klan came to his house one night, burned the house down. He got his wife and his 4 boys to safety, and he stayed to protect his house and his property and was killed. Medgar Evers killed by a sniper's bullet in his driveway. The 4 young girls in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King in Memphis, Tennessee. These persons did nothing more but either encourage persons to vote, encourage them to stand up for their rights. Harry T. Moore and his wife lived in Mims, Florida, and on their 25th wedding anniversary, their home was bombed, and Harry was killed. Harry and his wife both advocated voting for Blacks here in the state of Florida and equal pay for Black teachers. His wife died 3 days after the bombing. They both were inducted into the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame, and I had the honor to be the keynote speaker during their induction ceremonies. Now, and I'm going to close with that. And I talk about these events, these portions of American history and others, and this is just a microcosm of what is not taught. And I tell those stories because Black folk does not owe white America anything in terms of what they have done to help develop this country. Again, our history did not start with slavery. And even at the end of slavery, 159 years ago, this country told us, you're free. After we were responsible for American capitalism, after we built Wall Street figuratively and literally, after we built the Capitol and the White House, after we helped build buildings and the infrastructure on every Ivy League college, after we made this country obscenely wealthy, they said you are free, but they gave reparations to each plantation enslavers, enslaved owners, plantation owners. They got reparations from the federal government for every enslaved person that they lost. Yet in 159 years, with nothing, we still help develop this country. That is what is not taught. That's why racist white elected officials don't want you to know what Black folk have done in this country, because it will shine a spotlight on the racism of America for 300 years of slavery and since the end of. So again, thank you for letting me share just a few things with you. Thanks for the invitation, Dennis and William. And I will entertain whatever questions there might be from the.
Well, thank you so much. I learn something from you every time I hear your talks. And it's unfortunate that you could go on for the next several weeks telling stories like that because of what's happened in this country. But my first question is from Brooks Dane, who says, does Mr. Hurst have any recommendations for how we can tackle this problem you're talking about? The lack of acknowledgement of contributions, inventions by Black women and men in education, or rather the intentional whitewashing of them?
You know, one of the things, those of us who consider ourselves Christians, I always say that God has a way of jerking you from time to time to let you understand that what you thought you were doing was not the things you should have been doing. Somewhere in the process, even after white America would not allow enslaved persons to read and write and making it against the law, we decided that the oppressor would tell an honest history of the oppressed. And that did not happen. Yet we never internalized that part of our responsibility as formerly oppressed people, still oppressed in some regards, was to teach our own history. And I think that that's what happens today. Our churches and our community organizations and our fraternities and our sororities and even our HBCUs don't teach American history, don't teach Black history as it should be taught. Now, some churches and especially in South Florida, as a result of efforts by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, they've started what they call freedom schools. And they're teaching Black history on weekends in 2-hour and 3-hour shifts in Sarasota and in St. Petersburg and in Tampa they've started. And in Jacksonville at Mount Sinai through the James Weldon Johnson branch of ASALH, they've started teaching Black history on weekends. We have got to internalize that it is our responsibility to teach young Blacks what people who look like them did in this country and on whose shoulders they are standing. So when we look at what can we do, even though we don't have the identifiable vestiges of segregation, certainly the educational arena is as much a part of racism as anything that you can internalize and understand. And it is our responsibility to start teaching the truth about Black history. What Black history does is that it shines a spotlight on white history. So when you have people talking about Confederate monuments and the lost cause, and yet they don't want to admit that 11 states seceded from the United States of America, organized an enemy government called the Confederacy, and then sought to overthrow the United States of America. And the reason they did it, all of those 11 states had to list in what's called secessionist papers as to why they were seceding from the United States of America. And all 11 states said they were seceding because of slavery, not states' rights, not Southern heritage, not economics, but they were seceding because they wanted to maintain slavery. Yet today, no one, when they say keep the Confederate monuments up, but those monuments are monuments to slavery. Oh, no, it didn't have anything to do. We didn't fight the war for slavery, yes. So when we talk about history, when we talk about American history, tell the truth about American history. When we talk about Black history, make sure that young Black children and young white children understand the contributions by Black folk to American society and to the development of this country. And if you don't do anything but make sure that that young Black person or that young white person understands one fact a month, because American history is repetitious. We come up with these little cute, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. George Washington could not tell a lie, so he told the truth that he chopped down the cherry tree. What? But those are the gimmicks that we use to teach American history. Because anything that resonates with young people that they can remember over and over again, that's what they will do. So you give them the gimmicks to remember a lie, but you don't tell them the truth because you don't have those same kinds of gimmicks. So one of the things we can do is start, first of all, we've got to know Black history first. And all of these groups who love to go on cruises, who love to have their black and white balls, their all white parties, all these other things, I have nothing against that. If that's what they want to do, fine. But in the midst of all of that, Teach young Black children about their heritage and about their history. That's one of the first things we can do. Stop thinking that the oppressor is going to teach the oppressed history.
Other questions for Mr. Hurst?
Do you see any possibility of getting the Duval County school systems to change and open their doors?
Well, I think even though we talk about it over and over again, I think that we really have to internalize how important it is to vote. I mean, that is the cornerstone of our democracy. And many of us Black folk don't put the same importance on getting out and voting that we do some other things. And that did not just happen. When you understand it, I've got a good friend named Charlie Cobb, who was one of the real icons of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and he worked in 1964 in Mississippi. And one of the things they were working on was voter registration. In 1964, in the state of Mississippi, there were, population-wise, there were more Blacks in Mississippi than whites, 1964. But only 6% of Blacks in the state of Mississippi were registered to vote. That's one of the things that SNCC started, voter registration. That's the reason why Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were killed, because they were involved in registration. That's why Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit, was killed. She was involved with voter registration. That's all it was, registering people to vote. And we don't internalize how important it is. I mean, we see now as we come to another critical election at the national level, how important it is to be registered to vote. But we don't maintain that, you know, vote for president and governor and mayor, but also vote for these local elections, school board and city council and all of those too. Vote for all of them. That is part of your birthright as a citizen. That's what we have to internalize, how important it is. And that has to be our sermon, day in and day out, how important it is for Black folk to vote.
Our speaker last month talked about the Poor People's Campaign, which is working to get the vote out, and it sounded like a great organization.
You know, when a lot of people say when Dr. King started talking about poor folk and economy and the war, then that's when he had the bullseye put on his back. Bishop out of North Carolina is leading the Poor People's Campaign, not Bishop Barber. And there is, in this great country, the richest country in the world, and the number of homeless and the number of young people who go to sleep hungry at night is unfathomable, that we've got billionaires who during the pandemic had their wealth increased by 135%. And yet we have not raised the federal minimum wage in this country in years. Still at $7.75, I think, $7.85. Because every time there's a movement to do something about the federal minimum wage or doing things, there are always those who stand in the way to block it. For instance, in the early 1930s, under the New Deal programs, they passed the Social Security Act. And as a compromise to Southern elected officials in Congress, they eliminated domestic workers and migrant workers from the Social Security Act. Those persons did not qualify, even though they were working full-time in their jobs. 65% of every Black person in this country was either a domestic worker or a migrant worker in the early 1930s when the Social Security Administration, when the Social Security Act was passed. So for more than almost 30 years after it was passed, we did not have that safety net. So when we retired, we would have some money to look forward to when we could no longer work. That's the history of this country of wealth and the richest country in the world. So what you have to keep on doing as oppressed people, keep on fighting for who you are. Keep on fighting for what you are. And don't get tired.
Thank you. I might just add a couple of things. If you watch, you may be familiar with the much touted Civil War series by Ken Burns on public television. If you watch a series done by Dr. Gates from Harvard 25 years later on Reconstruction, and then go back and watch Burns, you'll see how history was and is tainted by a perspective that, you know, even the supposedly most brilliant writers and cinematographers.
Yeah.
It's just it's a wake-up call. But and the other thing I wanted to mention is I put the link in the chat. There is a great one-act play on Thurgood Marshall that was filmed at Howard in their Memorial Auditorium, and it's just brilliant.
The four books that I've written, after I wrote the first one, and as I would travel to speak on, it was never about a hot dog and a Coke, which again is the only it was going to be a personal account. It has become a history book now because there are things there that you won't find anyplace else, especially since the white press blacked out all news about it. But I was going to write my third book, Never Forget Who You Are. That was going to be the second book. But as I traveled, a lot of people said, you know, hey, Mr. Hurst, you keep talking about Black history, but I can't find anything about Black history for Blacks in Jacksonville. So I wrote the second book, Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told, about Black Jacksonville history, starting with James Weldon Johnson and Augusta Savage and A. Philip Randolph and Johnetta Betch Cole and Clanzell Brown, one of my great friends and a revered former executive director of the Urban League. In fact, he passed while he was still director of the Urban League. And the school integration plans that Thurgood Marshall in Coming to Town, and Charlie Cobb and Ronnie Belton and Alton Yates, and those persons that impacted not only this city and state, but the country. And when we understand that, I also talk about my involvement in changing the name of a white high school named after the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, which the school board did in 1958 with Nathan Bedford Forrest, and the fact that Dr. Vitti, who was the superintendent, asked if I would be one of the persons who would talk in support of changing the name in a panel discussion to young people at Forest the day that they voted whether to keep the name or to change the name. The young people at Nathan Bedford Forest voted 67 to 33% to change the name because they did not understand who and what Nathan Bedford Forrest was: a slave trader, the Fort Pillow butcher, a general in the Confederacy, and one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan and the first Imperial Wizard. When Mayor Deegan, in answering someone's question in the chat, it was a positive thing to take down the Confederate monument and memorial. It's a positive thing when you take down all references to a war that was fought to maintain slavery. We cannot, in this dual cultural society where we have culture clashes every day, we cannot have monuments that attest to an enemy government fighting to overthrow this country because of slavery and say, oh, no, you misinterpreted. It's about Southern heritage. Well, but part of your Southern heritage including having slaves. Yeah, but that's not why the war was fought. Well, why did you fight it? So any references to a Southern monument needs to come down. Any references to a war fought to maintain slavery needs to come down. That's not historical. That's racist. Just like slavery was racist.
Well, thank you for being with us tonight. I always promise people will finish at 8 so that they continue to come and feel that they can still have a late dinner or get to bed early. So it would be wonderful if you could come back for another talk to continue the conversation. It would be great.
You let me know and we'll massage schedules to get it done. Thank you for the invitation. It was an honor to spend time with you and the persons who are online.
Oh, the honor was all ours, Mr. Hurst. Thank you so much.